Let's start with my grandparents. On Dad's side, it was a grandma and my grandfather, whom I never met nor knew. My grandmother was Eula May Fortney, and my grandfather was Tranquilla Fortney. They met, married, and conceived my father in Central City, Kentucky. On my mother's side, it was Mama and Papa, Charles Westerfield and Stella Westerfield. And my mother was conceived along with 6 sisters and 2 brothers in that part of the family. Eula and Tranquilla in Central City, Kentucky, conceived my dad, Carl Wright Fortney, and Charles and Stella Westerfield on that side in Lebanon Junction, Kentucky, conceived my mother, Bertha Westerfield. After Tranquilla died, my grandmother and my dad, Carl Fortney, moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where presumably he met my mother on the Westerfield side. And they were married, and from that marriage, my twin brother and I were conceived in Louisville, Kentucky. We have an older stepbrother, and that relationship was something we'll discuss at a later time. So in any event, my twin brother and I were born in Louisville, Kentucky, 11 December 1933. And then we spent our life until the time we were teenagers, where he went into the Marine Corps and I went into the Navy. And so once I went into the Navy, then I stayed for 30 years. And during that 30-year period, I married twice. First marriage lasted 18 years, and that was to Carolyn Fortney. And then from that marriage came 2 children, Lawrence, the oldest, and Ken, the youngest. Carol and I were divorced, and while I was in the Navy, and then after that divorce, I married my current wife, the first marriage, 18 years, current wife, Lori, and that's 36 years, and from that marriage came 2 children. The oldest is Justin, and then there's Stephanie. Lori's first husband was killed in Vietnam, Al Fry, and from that marriage there were 4 children. Mark and Matt and Bill and Les. There are a whole lot of grandchildren who came along, but that's the family structure as we are today. So when my last assignment in the Navy was as commanding officer of the recruiting district there in Louisville, Kentucky. It was the same place I had enlisted 30 years previously, and I got out commanding officer of the recruiting district. And in those intervening years, over a 30-year period, I finished high school, I finished college, and I had begun and will begin doing a number of things. Among those things are I will do some graduate and postgraduate work. Went to seminary after I got out of the Navy. Went to Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and then left that and did some graduate work and postgraduate work in counseling psychology, and had done some study in theology. And then the undergraduate degree was in human resource management, and did some graduate work and secured some degrees, were awarded some degrees in personnel management. All of that took place in comparatively short period of time. The graduate, postgraduate work, the undergraduate work did many years over that 30-year period. Once I completed the Navy, then and did the education thing, Lori and I began a post-Navy journey to a lot of different places. The first was the Christian Appalachian Project in Lancaster, Kentucky, where I spent a couple of years as their Director of Personnel Administration. We went to Dothan, Alabama for a very short period of time, where I was project manager for Universal Energy Systems, introducing high technology into advanced helicopter training for the Navy, for the Army. From there, we went to pastor church in Fern Creek, Kentucky for a couple of years. We went to Wheaton, Illinois, where I was Director of Administration for another nonprofit, Bibles for the World. From there, went back to Louisville, where I pastored the Larchmont Church of God for 7-8 years, during which I was volunteer chaplain for the Louisville Fire Department. Left there, went to pastor a church for 2 years in Mount Carmel, Illinois. From there, had open heart surgery. Moved to Oklahoma, where Justin and Stephanie were both in college, where I did some consulting work for another nonprofit group called Youth Cornerstone. When we left Mount Carmel, we moved to Guthrie, Oklahoma, where we established residence, bought a house, still there. As I say, I worked for a short period of time for Youth Cornerstone, setting up a volunteer network for them. Then went on staff for Belle Isle Church, which became Crossings Community Church, where I was the pastor for senior adult ministry. Left there, went to North Carolina to pastor a all African American congregation for 2 years. At the same time, worked as the Director of Human Resources for Sears in 3 different locations, High Point, Greensboro, and some other city I don't recall now. When we left there, we came back to Guthrie, still had our house here, where I became executive director for the American Red Cross for a short period of time, became the human resource management for the Guthrie Job Corps Training Center, and then went to the state, where I worked for 6 years as chief of the Office of Human Resources. And then during this time, because that was sort of a bivocational ministry, we would travel on Sundays up to Blackwell, Oklahoma, where we still travel, to pastor that church, lead worship on Sunday. So that's sort of where we are now. I served I guess served is the word, 6 years for the state, working for the Oklahoma State Department of Health as chief of the Office of Human Resources. And then I took early retirement from that combination of 6 years of service and age, because now I will be 77 next month. And so the combination of those two things, early retirement from the Department of Health, and now are about to embark on another part of the journey. We just don't know yet where that's going to be. Presumably it will be in Guthrie, but what I'll be doing is yet to be determined. Right now, I'm still looking for a job, but right now am about to embark upon doing some consulting, coaching, and counseling, and perhaps a little work with my friend John Spence, where using his skills and mine combined, we might be able to do some entrepreneurial work in terms of meeting some legitimate needs that are out there someplace. When Dale and I were growing up, that I thought might that resonated with me, and I can recollect with some kind of fondness, and they were sort of off the track and unusual. The first one was when, as Dale and I were growing as boys, Mom was selling war bonds in Kaufman Strauss department store in Louisville, and so on Saturday we'd go down and meet her and have lunch at the Blue Boar, and then Dale and I would maybe pick up a quarter, 35 cents or 50 cents, whatever it happened to be, and then we would buy some snacks at McCrory's across the street from where she worked, and then we'd head 3 or 4 blocks down the street where there were several theaters, all in one compressed area. There was the Strand and the Mary Anderson and the Lowe's and the Kentucky and the Ohio. And the only significant part about this was, because we didn't have a lot of money, and I don't advocate this for any of my kids or grandkids that are watching this now, for anyone for that matter, but Dale and I would try to sneak into all these movies. We would, not devious, but we'd look for a time when the guy that was taking the tickets might not be looking, and we'd sort of just, go with flow and get on in there. Sometimes we were not able to do that, and so we'd pay the price of admission, but we would try to do that. Sometimes we'd be successful, other times not so successful. Not really recommended, but that's what you do when you don't have a lot of money and you're wanting to see some movies, and so we did that. So I recall that. And then there's another time we got a little bit older, because this is all when we were just kids growing up. And Dale and I, we would go to the Y a lot, and we'd box each other and wrestle each other, but we got into, can't remember whether it was Golden Gloves or what it was, but both of us became boxers. Not really very good, but not bad either. Enough to, a couple things I remember about the boxing. One is we'd have a match, and then after and we always won for whatever reason, but after we'd win the match, it only lasted about 3 rounds, we go over and buy a steak dinner. Well, in any event, both of us had boxed a little bit, and then one night I was scheduled to box out at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and I had something else to do. I can't remember whether it was a camping out experience or whether I was a date that I needed to keep, but in any event, whatever it was, I asked Dale if he would go out and box for me, and he said, yeah, he'd do that. He just said he'd do it, and he did. And I can remember the next day, he was very, very put out, irritated, sort of mad at me. He says, brother, he says, I'll never do that again. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, they put me in the ring with this guy who was the light featherweight or lightweight or whatever champion of Kentucky in Golden Gloves, and he just knocked me all over that damn ring. He said, for about a round and a half, I stayed a round and a half, he said he just clobbered me, and then finally, I think Dale said they threw in the towel or whatever. But in any event, he was just upset about it, and I told him, well, I had no idea that's who he would be boxing, no idea that's the way it came out, but I can remember that he really, he did it for me. And I guess he never got over it. I don't think I would either. But in any event, why it happened, and I can remember that fondly. He and I maybe not fondly, that's not the word, but I can remember it. He and I talked about it a couple of times, and then as the years went by, why we reminisced and recollected about that. This was back during growing up too. Probably happened even back before these other two things that I just got through sharing. We lived in a small apartment there in Clarksdale, up on the 2nd and 3rd floor, and on in the front lawn, which was probably only 6 or 7 feet, and just very, very small. Dale and I would get out there and we'd play football. Can you imagine this, playing football? And we didn't have enough money to buy a football. And so we use this old boxing glove, and we get out on the front lawn, just not very big at all, and we play this game of football. I would throw it, he would catch it, I would tackle him. Looking back on it, I wonder how we did that. But when you're kids and when you're growing up and when that's all you've got, you do the best you can with what you've got. And he and I talked about that a lot too growing up. Playing football with this old boxing glove there on the front lawn of that apartment house in Clarksdale, the project, Clarksdale. We had many, many golden memories. As you look back on it, you wonder how in the world you did that. Clarksdale, in those, we called it a project, but at the time, there at the beginning of World War II, it really wasn't bad. It was just freshly constructed. Mom and Dad, Dale and I, Grandma lived with us for a while, playing there in Clarksdale. There was a community center, there was a football field, there was a library. Golden years, when you didn't have a lot, you made the best with what you had. And so Clarksdale, very good to us, and a lot of golden memories. Dale and I, as we got to be teenagers, both we lived pretty close to a Catholic church, St. Boniface Catholic Church, and as a result of that, we were able to go to this Catholic high school without having to pay much, if any. I can't remember now if any at all, but tuition. And so we went to this Catholic high school, which is down the west end of town, and they had these two guys that were also in the high school that went on to make a name for themselves. Dale and I went out for the junior varsity football team, and went out, got suited up, padded up, all the rest of that. And I can remember that on that football team were two guys whose names became, if not famous, at least maybe infamous, but in any event, why we associated with them. I can remember going out to football practice. Paulie Miller was the coach, and I would, in the back of my mind, think, why are they spending a lot of time with this guy over there, Paulie Miller, the coach? They'd have a tire that would swing back and forth, and Paul was instructing this guy down on one knee to throw a ball through this swinging tire, and then must have seen something I didn't see. I thought that I should be over there throwing the ball, but I wasn't. But the guy that was down there on one knee, who he was coaching, was named Paul Harning. And Paul went on to do very good at Flagey, leading that football team. And then he went to Notre Dame, where he also did very well. And then he went on to play for the Green Bay Packers, where he was either All-Pro or nominated for All-Pro. Of course, he ran into a little bit of heavy sledding too, because he was betting for some football games on the side. But in any event, I think that came out okay. But Paul Harning, and then Paul was a year behind me, and then a year ahead of me was another guy that played a pretty good brand of football. His name was Howard Schnellenberger. Went on to play for the University of Kentucky and was, I think, an All-American. Came back to coach, came out to Oklahoma to coach for 1 year. Smoked a pipe. They didn't care a lot for him, and he went on to fame. Back in Louisville, coaching the University of Louisville. Turned out he did very well back there. Made a name for himself. I can remember that when I was pastoring the church there at Larchmont, I would stop in for breakfast once in a while at Denny's or one of those restaurants. And I walked in there one day, and there was Paul, and there was Howard Schnellenberger. He had been to Oklahoma, come back, and he was smoking his pipe and reading the paper. I said, Howard, you probably don't remember me, but and I was also a volunteer chaplain for the Louisville Fire Department. I said, you were a year ahead of me at Flagey. He said, no, I don't remember you, but Doyle, how you doing? I said, I was doing good. And so I got a chance to sit down and visit with Howard. Paul Harning, when I was commanding officer of recruiting, we had an all-Kentucky company formed, and the public affairs officer said, you really need, Skipper, you really need to invite some people to come and be a part of this. They held it at Louisville Downs there at Louisville. And so we invited Paul Harning and Howard Schnellenberger. Howard couldn't come. Paul, Cheryl Sipes, and Pee Wee Reese. They all came except for Howard Schnellenberger, and I was able to sit down and talk with them a little bit about the times that we had spent together back there at Flagey. Not Pee Wee Reese. The only thing that Pee Wee remembered was that he and I as I was growing up, donated blood together there to American Red Cross. So I was laying on a cot beside Pee Wee giving blood, and we talked a little bit about it. He remembered it for whatever reason. So in any event, those were some of the recollections and some of the memories with regard to the earlier days there in Louisville. So it all began in January of 1952 when I enlisted in the Navy in Louisville, Kentucky, January 1952, January 2nd. As a matter of fact, just turned 18 and shipped into the Navy. It's an old nautical expression, shipped into the Navy. Didn't go aboard ship until many years after that. My twin brother Dale, we've already had a portion of tape concerning our growing up together, had already gone into the first the Marine Corps, and then he got out of there because he didn't like it. Then he went into the Army, got out of that because he didn't like it. But while he was away, I decided, well, just go ahead and go in the Navy. And so I did. And when I went in, on the day that I shipped in, my mother and dad, we had dinner together at the Sealback Hotel. And then from there, they took me over to Union Station, and I took the train from Louisville to Waukegan, Illinois, just north of Chicago, and that's where the Navy boot camp was, Recruit Training Center in Waukegan, Illinois. Was in recruit training from January of 52 until March of 52, and I think I'd already shared some experiences that happened during the recruit training, but we may or may not have captured that on tape, and so I'll go back over a few of those when I go back and revisit these different assignments. So anyway, went to boot camp in Great Lakes, and that was from January to March of 1952, and then after I finished recruit training, went back on leave, recruit leave, and then after that took a train to Seattle, Washington, from there a ship to Kodiak, Alaska, and spent I got there in April of 52, and from April 52 until November of 53 was in Kodiak, Alaska, and then left Kodiak, Alaska to go back to Personnelman A School in Bainbridge, Maryland, from November 53 until March of 54. Finished Personnelman A School there, and then went to Agana, Guam. Was on Guam from 54 until 55 as a Personnelman Seaman, then Personnelman Third Class, Petty Officer, and then after finished tour on Guam, went to the Naval Air Station, Norfolk, Virginia, was there from 55 to 58, first at the Naval Air Station, and then what was called the Commander Naval Air Base's 5th Naval District. While there, was promoted from second class to first class, Personnelman first class, and then I think it was again in November 58, went to Personnelman Class C School, which was out at San Diego, classification interviewing school, learned how to be a classifier, an interviewer, organizational analysis, and then was prepared to go to sea, and thankfully wasn't chosen to do that, but instead went over to North Africa, Morocco, and so from 1959 to 1960 was stationed at the Naval Communication Facility at Sidi Ia, which was outside of the old Port Lyote, which is now Kenitra, at the Naval Communication Facility. While there, made Chief Petty Officer, Personnelman, Chief Personnelman, and also selected for Warrant Officer. And so was appointed Warrant Officer, Chief Petty Officer, Warrant Officer in April of 1960, and again thought I was going to go to sea and had orders to go to the USS Boxer, I think it was, but then the Navy changed its mind, decided that instead they were going to send me to the Naval Receiving Station in Brooklyn, New York, which they did, and that was as a warrant officer. Warrant officer W01 is what they called it, and stayed there at the receiving station. I'm looking at my notes here, from 1960, 1963. While I was there, I was selected for, promoted to Chief Warrant Officer, W2, and then selected for Commissioned Officer. Skipped ensign, went from Chief Warrant Officer W2 to Lieutenant Junior grade. By skipping ensign, I missed the opportunity, they didn't want me to go there, to Newport, Rhode Island, for what was called the Knife and Fork School, learn how to be a full-fledged naval officer. But skipped that. They thought I was either good enough or dumb enough. I don't know what it was, but went from W2 to JG and spent 3 years there at the Naval Receiving Station. After completing 3 years at the Naval Receiving Station, I was assigned to the Joint Staff down at United States Southern Command in Panama, Quarry Heights, Panama. And so from 1963 until 1965, I was stationed United States Southern Command, what they called the Staff Personnel Officer for the commanding general, four-star Army general in the Panama Canal Zone, Commander-in-Chief, United States Southern Command. I was selected for and promoted from Lieutenant JG to lieutenant, full lieutenant there. And after completing that tour, was sent, first time I went to sea was 1965, as lieutenant. The United States USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, CVA 42, and had 2 Mediterranean deployments, one a Westpac deployment to Vietnam. I'll tell you about that when we go back and pick up all these things. So 1967, they assigned me to the Pentagon outside of Washington, D.C., 1967 and 1970 for 3 years. While at the Pentagon, I was selected for and promoted to Lieutenant Commander, and after making Lieutenant Commander, I was sent to the Naval Air Technical Training Center at Memphis, Tennessee for another 3-year period from let's back up a little bit. I went down to the Naval Air Technical Training Center, 1960, and that was 1970. So I was Pentagon from 1967 to 1970, and then went to Nat Center down at Millington, Memphis. While in the Pentagon, let me go back, because aboard Roosevelt, I was the administrative officer, and then they wanted me to be the personnel officer, and then back to the administrative officer. So I was the executive assistant to the executive officer on board Roosevelt. So when I got to the Pentagon, I was first the staff secretary for joint papers. Joint papers meant you process the Navy part of joint papers so that they would staff those to the Joint Chiefs, and then the Joint Chiefs would be briefed on those joint papers and then go down to the tank, they called it, at the Naval Military Command Center down below the Pentagon. And then they would approve those joint papers, put a red stripe on them, and then they would become official. So I did that, and then while at the Pentagon, started out as the staff secretary for joint papers, and then was selected to replace the guy who was executive assistant to both the director and deputy director of strategic plans and policy in Op 60 for the Navy. Then I went down to Memphis, first to be the assistant department head, assistant personnel officer, and then while doing that became a regimental commander. And then they asked me if I'd like to be reassigned to the staff of the newly formed Chief of Naval Air Technical Training. Said I thought I'd like to do that, and so transferred over to his staff. First one was Admiral Bergner, and then was Admiral Sackett, then was Admiral Malone. and was for a year the training program coordinator for all the Navy Navy enlisted training in the Navy, and then became head of their manpower department. And then from there went down to the downtown Memphis as executive officer of the Navy Recruiting District Memphis. Did that for 2 years from 1974 to 1977, after which I went back to head up the manpower branch on the staff of Chief of Naval Education and Training. Did that for another 3 years, 1977, 1980, and then was picked to be commanding officer of a recruiting district in Louisville, Kentucky, and was transferred there and spent the last year and a half as commanding officer of the Naval Recruiting District in Memphis. And then I retired. And so that was a quick synopsis through the chronology of a Navy career. From the time I enlisted in 1952 until the time I retired in 1981, latter part of 1981. As I said, in January of 1952, I got on the train after having hugged and kissed Mom and Dad and went to Great Lakes. While I was at Great Lakes undergoing boot camp, where they transition you from being a civilian to a sailor, a couple of things that happened were interesting to me, and perhaps they might be of interest to the kids and the grandkids, anybody else. Of course, Lori, anybody else that she's heard these so many times, and it got to be old hat with her. And most of the kids have heard it too, but they were significant things that happened, at least were significant to me. While at recruit training at boot camp, I went through all the things you go through in boot camp. You learn all about the Navy, you learn the terminology, you learn all the nautical things, you do the firefighting. They would teach you to swim. If you didn't know how to swim, I already knew how to swim, so I did that and did some competitive swimming for the Navy in boot camp. Hadn't been there too long, and they had selected me to be a platoon leader. I forget which platoon it was, doesn't really matter. At first they thought they were going to make me a company commander, and then this other guy that had ridden up on the train with me impressed them more than I did, so he got to be company commander, recruit company commander, and they made me a platoon leader. And so I led one of the platoons. There were, I don't know, I forget now how many people were in the company, but in any event, there were 2 platoons. You had the platoon company commander, and you had the 2 platoon leaders, and I was one of them. So I've been there for about, I guess we've been there for about 3 weeks. And I must have been talking when I shouldn't have been talking or whatever, because they picked up that I had done some boxing just in high school and just before I was I can't remember where I was in Golden Gloves or not. I think I was. And so I guess I said I'd been boxing. So they asked me if I would represent the company in what they call the smoker. And in a moment of weakness or naivete or whatever it was, I said, yeah, I do that. And so they put me in the ring. It was on a Monday night, I think, Monday or Tuesday night. Put me in the ring. This guy was about 6'3", and as I recollect, he had red hair, and he was big, red-haired guy, looked to be remarkably fit, and I was fit for whoever I was at that time. Still, I think I'd got to be 6'1". I probably weighed about what I weigh now, about 175. And so I went out there, and I already told you the story of sending Dale to Fort Knox to box, and got the hell beat out of him. But anyway, that night, this guy 6'3", I knew there was one of 2 things I had to do. I either had to take a beating, or I had to get out there and take care of it. And so I thought to myself, I'll not make it past the first round. So I'll just go out there and try as best I could to whip up on him and get the thing stopped as quickly as I could. Either it would be stopped quickly because of me, they won't only going to go 3 rounds, or maybe I'd take him out. As it turned out, I took him out. Got out there, and it was in the first round, and I got it. I can't remember now, it's all foggy, but I caught him. I guess I caught him with a right to the stomach and came back with the left to the jaw because I TKO'd him. TKO'd him in the first round, and that's where I hung up the gloves and have never boxed again. Never. Up in Kodiak, I'll get to that. This one guy hung one on me, but I didn't do anything in retaliation. I'd become Christian by then, so I hung up the gloves, and that's the last time I did that. The only other significant thing that happened, I guess, in recruit training was that I had sung a little bit in a quartet while we were in high school. Dale and I, a guy named Charlie Tishner and Buck Tishner. Buck sang bass, Charlie sang lead, Dale sang something, and I sang something. I can't remember now what it was, tenor, I guess. A little harmony in there. But in any event, we had sung, I had sung, and so I let that go to my head. Went over and auditioned for the Blue Jackets choir, sort of a select choir, it's just recruits, and they said, yeah, we'd love to have you be a part of it. And I can remember going to rehearsal 2 times, but I can't remember singing in the choir for anything official. So it must have been just to get me out of the barracks and give me something to do. The chief liked me, the chief petty officer, who was the company commander, not the recruit commanding, company commander. He liked me, and he thought, I remember him saying to me, one day you're going to lead something. And I thought, well, that's nice. He was a nice guy. Visited the company commander, whose name was Guthrie, and I visited his house, had dinner with he and his wife one night, and that was sort of special too. At any event, why, that was the recruit training experience, and then after recruit training was over, why, I went home on recruit leave and then went back to Chicago and caught a train that took me from Chicago to Seattle, where I caught the ship to go to my first duty station. You don't have nice guys as company commanders. You got guys that are going to transition you from the civilian to military, but underneath that, he was a nice guy. That's why he invited Guthrie and I to go out and have dinner with his wife. I assume that's why it was. And so in any event, why, that was human interest. We went out, had dinner with the chief. He brought us back. Guthrie, and I can't remember that was his first name or last name. I think that was his last name. Can't remember what his first name was now. But he was a pretty sharp guy, and so visited with him a couple of times there in the barracks. He and I told sea stories, and then I met a guy named Worley, whom I've come in contact with over the years. I call him every once in a while. I still live outside of Louisville. Met him. There was a guy named Bauer, and I can't remember who the other guy was now. But in any event, at that time I was pretty quiet and sort of kept to myself, because Dale and I had our relationship was all of our lives. There were some friends back in Louisville growing up. 2 of them I've already mentioned: Charlie Tishner, Buck Tishner, Irv Lambert, Art Lambert. Played football. I played football. Tried to play football with him. And then there was Horning and the other guy that can't remember his name, Schnellenberger. But they weren't really close friends. They were close friends growing up. But in boot camp, I can't remember making any kind of really close friends. And so that's why they're just not in my memory. I do remember a couple of times I'd take the train from Waukegan into Chicago to visit the USO, but usually I'd do that, I'd be by myself. There wasn't a lot of closely formed relationships and friendships as far as boot camp itself is concerned. Now, when we get into Kodiak, why it's a little bit different, because if you're there for 2 years, you have to make some acquaintance and associations, and I did. But boot camp was pretty much survival 101, and didn't really have a lot of deep relationships there, and so it was mostly the ones that I've already experienced. So anyway, took the train and went back to on recruit leave, and saw some of those people back there in the 2 weeks that we had, or whatever it was, to there, and visited with them. But in any event, the train ride out from Great Lakes, from Chicago to Seattle, I can remember that we'd stop along the way. It's beautiful. The scenery was beautiful, even though it was in March. Well, and things were still snowy and all the rest of that. Was great train ride. I'd get off. Thing I remember about the train going over was, number one, they had a club car, and I go in the club car, and there was this steward. Well, it wasn't a steward, porter. It would make hot chocolate, and I'd have hot chocolate and toast. And for me, man, that was just really neat stuff. And look out the window, and then when the train would stop, you'd be able to get off and look around. But the other really neat thing about the train was I had my own sleeping compartment. 2 nights going from Chicago to Seattle with a sleeper, where I'd go in, close the door, just me, That was neat, because I'd never done that before. And then the train got to Seattle, and then there were working parties where I'd go out, and for whatever reason, they always chose me to lead the working party. And so I'd do that a couple of times, waiting for the ship, MSTS ship, that was going to take us from Seattle to Kodiak, Alaska. And so spent a couple of days in Seattle. Don't know that I had run around with anybody then, any friend. I guess pretty much just, sort of a loner. But in any event, took the ship from Seattle to Kodiak. Must have taken 5 or 6 days, can't remember like that. Like now, never got sick, a lot of people did. 5 decks down. Yeah, the only thing I remember about being aboard ship going to Kodiak was I didn't like it. 5 decks down was not my idea of, and about that much room between your nose and the guy that was sleeping, and there were 5 stacked high. I thought there must be a better way to get from Seattle to Kodiak, and so I looked for it, and I found it. It was told them I'd do anything to get out of that compartment, and they let me take care of the library. Take care of it meant I could sleep up there, and check the books in, whatever. So from Seattle to Kodiak, Alaska, for the most part, I was not down below, but I was up in the library, and found a sort of a refuge from going down and being a part of that, because everybody got sick. I didn't, but most everybody got sick, and not a pleasant time that I can remember. I've tried to put all that out of my mind. But in any event, got to Kodiak, and for the next 2 years spent in Kodiak, Alaska. Things I remember in Kodiak, I think when we did this tape before, and we did get it right, I had enumerated some of the things that happened in Kodiak. When I first got there, they said, I said, I'm an athlete, and so I'd like to be assigned. They were saying, well, where would you like to be assigned? I said, I'd like to be assigned to special services, the recreation part, and where you could do some sports stuff. Well, they said, well, whoever it was that made those assignments, I guess it was the personnel office, said, well, if that's what you want to do, we'll assign you to the special services. But I didn't start out doing sports right away. They assigned me to the Seabees, because the Seabees were constructing this new hobby shop facility. First they were, and in constructing it meant that they were putting the thing together, and I said, well, what shall I do? And they said, well, number one, stay out of the way, and then you can help us. And helping them meant that I was going to clean their tools, that I was going to sweep the floor, that I was going to take the paint brushes and do a little bit of painting, not a lot, do a little bit of painting. And that went on for about 3 months. And so for 3 months, I was the flunky, not even the chief flunky. The flunky for the Seabees, really a motley crew. But their motto, the difficult we do right away and the impossible takes a little longer, was a good motto because they could put anything together. And they did. So they constructed this hobby shop, and the guy that was in charge was a chief by the name of Lightning. They called him Lightning, that wasn't his name. Lightning was the chief, and the chief and I got along very well. He thought that I was a pretty good guy for a young guy, and I thought the chief just did everything right. So in any event, when they finished the job and they got the hobby shop all constructed, Lightning, the chief, said, "Would you like to work in the hobby shop?" And about that time, I would have liked to have done anything. So I did, and he convinced the lieutenant commander, who was the special services officer, that that would be a good thing. And so for about 3 months, or 4 months, can't remember now, maybe it's 3 months, I was not in charge of the hobby shop. I was on the night shift of the hobby shop, which meant that I checked things in, checked things out, and in the course of doing that, the chief said, "How would you like to," because he was, in addition to being a chief Seabee, he must have been a builder. He also did some photographic stuff. So he said, "How would you like to learn how to do these photographs?" I said, "I thought that would be a great idea." So he showed me how to take the film that came in into the dark room and to develop the pictures and print out the pictures, and so I did that. But I also took care of the hobby shop. I'd sweep it out, swab the deck, take care of the inventory and stuff like that. And I had checked out this correspondence course because I had a high clerical aptitude, administrative aptitude, and so I thought, well, I'll teach myself to type. And so I did. At night, either during breaks or when everybody else had gone home, I taught myself in this correspondence course how to type. As it happened, it held me in good stead later because, well, that's later. But in any event, I learned how to type. So two significant things happened in the hobby shop. Learned how to type, learned how to develop pictures. Well, I still hadn't gotten, trying to think of the name of this lieutenant commander. I think it's Brandenburg. Can't remember that exactly, but he had, it was time to select. Everybody goes mess cooking. Go in the Navy, you got to do 4 or 6 weeks mess cooking, something like that. So it was my turn, and they transferred me over to the mess cooking detail. In the interim, I had started going to the chapel every Sunday. Go to chapel Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, whenever I could, chapel be open, I would go. And I met some really interesting people who later became very dear friends. One was a guy named Jim Moon, who was the choir director. He directed the choir. And the other was named Smith, George Smith, and he was the organist. Well, in addition to being assigned to the hobby shop, you have a barracks, and in the barracks you begin to form relationships. You're talking about human side. And so it just happened that George Smith, Jim Moon, and a fellow named William Flanagan, Bill Flanagan, were 3 guys whom I got to know very well. George Smith was an accomplished organist, played the piano too. And for the rest of my tour in Kodiak, George and I sort of hung out together, as did Jim Moon, who was college graduate, and Jim was the secretary, assistant, that really I can't remember what the name is now, for the commanding officer, and Bill Flanagan wasn't the secretary, wasn't the writer, but whatever we called ourselves for the executive officer. So George Smith was the organist for the chapel and was a chaplain's assistant. Didn't call him then, but that's what he did. And the organist, and then there was Bill Flanagan. He was also a college graduate and went on to be a lawyer. And I'm not sure what happened to Jim. Probably went on to be a choir director someplace. So you had George Smith, who was the organist, Jim Moon, who was the choir director, Bill Flanagan, who went on to be a corporate attorney and made lots of money. Of course, he came from lots of money too. So Jim Moon, George Smith, and Bill Flanagan. Continued to correspond with them for many, many years. And so here I am mess cooking, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Still get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Back then I didn't like to. Now I just get up at 5 o'clock. And then at 5 o'clock I go down to the mess decks, and then can't remember this guy's name, but he looked like George Segal. His hair was slicked back and just a real fine looking fellow. And he'd have a Bible study down there. And I'd always get up there at 5 o'clock, 5:15 I'd be down. He'd have that Bible study. And I was going to the chapel. So the Lord was very significant in my life before I went into the Navy, and then when I went into the Navy. And this guy would hold the Bible study. And so I stayed mess cooking for about, I guess about 2 weeks out of 6 weeks. And George Smith, who was the organist, and the fact that I was going to the chapel, said, hey, the chaplain's looking for another chaplain's assistant, someone to help him out, but we can't take you out right now, but we can get you sprung from mess cooking, get you assigned over at the flag plot, the 17th Naval District. One of the guys that had been going to the chapel was being detached, and he had a job he was quartermaster first class over in Flag Plot. And he said, if you'd like to come over and help out in Flag Plot, we could get you off this mess cooking. Can't get you the chaplain's office yet because there's not an opening, but that's sort of down the pike. And I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. And so after 2 weeks of mess cooking, I was transferred over to 17th Naval District Headquarters into Flag Plot. Flag Plot is where up on the big board they have little pictures, little pins and representations, icons of Navy ships, Russian ships in that particular area up in the Aleutians. And I thought, well, that's good. They're going to let me plot ships. Sorry, it didn't turn out that way. What they had in mind was, we're going to let you still get up at 5 o'clock, but you come over and you make the coffee and you stand the watches, but you will be contributing toward plotting all these Soviet submarines and naval vessels and for the 17th Naval District. And so I did. I started my Navy career, first one there, making coffee, and 30 years later, I ended my Navy career because as commanding officer, and I'll get to that, of the Navy Recruiting District, I'd still be the first one in, and I'd make the coffee. When I was later, every place I've been, I always first one in, make the coffee, regardless of what, whether I was a seaman, whether I was commander, first one in, make the Navy coffee. I thought that was significant. I'm not at all sure why, but that's what happened. So here I am, 17th Naval District, making this coffee, first one in, standing watches. Now the watches you stand, there's one that's not so glorious because you just sit there, and if somebody calls, you take the call and you make the necessary entry in the log and you make the coffee. And if they have a message run to be made anyplace, you make the message run. Weren't a lot of those. Primarily, my basic job as a seaman apprentice was to make the coffee. But I was on the staff of the commandant of the Naval District up there. I think it was 17th Naval District, commandant 17th Naval District. And I was in Flag Plot. Not a bad deal. The only other significant thing that happened in Flag Plot was that one of the watches that I would stand was looking for Russian submarines, but you really weren't looking for them. What happened was I would have the mid-watch, which meant from midnight until 4 o'clock in the morning. I would put on the parka and the big pants and all this, and have an M1 that wasn't loaded, and they would put me on a bus, take me out to the old submarine piers, which was really out there someplace in Kodiak, and I have no idea to this day where it was, but down to the submarine piers, and I'd have that M1 strapped to my back, and I have a pair of binoculars looking for Russian submarines. Well, there weren't any Russian submarines operating that area. Flag plot should have told them that, could have told them that, probably did tell them that. But the Navy assigns you to watches regardless of whatever else is going on, because you got to spend your time standing watch. Later, it comes in a different way. You're on the bridge, and you're really doing some meaningful stuff. But here I was, as a kid, 18, 19 years old, 18 I guess still, and I'm out there looking for Russian submarines that weren't there, with an M1 that didn't have any ammunition. And so I'd go out there and I'd freeze my ass off, and I'd come back, and the bus would come out, they'd bring me back. And so I did that for about 3 months. Make the coffee, stand watches, be in flag plot on the Admiral's staff. Still going to the chapel every Sunday night, and Wednesday, whenever the chapel will be open, I'd be there. And so the chaplain Peter McPhee, he called me over. He said, "Understand you're interested in helping out being a chaplain's assistant." I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He was commander, and he said, "Well, and of course I was up there all the time. He got to know me. I got to know him, got to know his wife. Lovely people. Can't remember his name, but a lovely person." And he said, "Well, here's what you can do," because I already started teaching Sunday school, 5, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, what it was. And he said, "Let's be the chaplain's assistant." I said, "That sounds great. Well, where's my office? Who will I counsel?" And he says, "Well, Doyle," he said, he says, "George Smith, he doesn't have an office, and he's the organist. And here's what you and he are going to do. Here's the way you're going to assist me." He says, "He'll play the organ, you sing in the choir, but there's this chapel to take care of, which means that the chapel has to be clean, which means that the decks have to be swept, and the decks have to be swabbed, and you got to move the pews, and you got this machine that goes around polishing the deck, buffer, and you operate the buffer, and then you continue to teach Sunday school, and be involved in the youth work and all the rest of that." And so I said, "That sounds great to me." So for the rest of my time in Kodiak, that's pretty much what I did. I was the chaplain's assistant. I would clean the chapel. George and I cleaned the chapel, sang in the choir. Once or twice they let me direct it, but sang in the choir because Jim Moon was still there. And that's what we did. We cleaned the chapel. We helped in any way that Chaplain McPhee felt that we could help out. And that was pretty good stuff because it gave me a chance to not have to be working for the Seabees. I did play basketball, went out, played for the basketball team, got a nice uniform, didn't set the world on fire. But did that. Didn't do any swimming because it was in Kodiak, and met some more interesting people. I can't remember their names now, but they had also were going up to the chapel, and one of them had a car, and so I had an opportunity to not only take the bus places, but and when they left the island, they sold me the car. So there was about a 2-week period that I had a car. But in any event, that was the Kodiak experience. Ground Defense Force went out into the mountains. Again, they never let us load up the weapons, but this Marine was training me how to be a Ground Defense Force guy, and I had the M1, and I can remember putting my thumb in there and not getting it out in time, and it just smashed my right thumb. I can remember that. And then there was one time we went out, and there were Kodiak bears. I know you've heard of them. And I heard one night. I was out there, wasn't sure what to do with it because the M1 wasn't loaded, and I couldn't outrun the bear. I think I probably just laid there, prayed that it would go away, and it did. They had a ski chalet there, and I went skiing once. I guess really the reason I went skiing because there was this very attractive school teacher, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just go up there and hang out, around her. Maybe she might take pity on me. She never did. But I went skiing, and I went skiing one time. I went up at the top and had the skis checked out, went down, ended up halfway down on my bottom side, and spent the rest of the slope going down. Took the tram or whatever it was back up, hung those skis up too. Never tried that again. Tried water skiing a couple times, never tried skiing. That was sort of the cure. Nice ski chalet. Went up a couple of times, but always just to enjoy the fire. The Kodiak Naval Station, in order to get into the town of Kodiak, you had to take a bus. And I'd take the bus into town. I'd go, and Bill Flanagan, Jim Moon, George Smith sometime go in. But the road from the naval station into Kodiak was very, very narrow road. And it was high, and you could look down and see Kodiak Bay, and there was only about a foot, may have been broader than that, but that's what I remember, a foot that kept you from going over that ledge. And there are times when I can remember that gravel shifting, and I thought we were going to go over, but we never did. We went in. Kodiak, Alaska, very small community. Most of the time I went in, I went to the church. They had a small Baptist church there, and I'd go to church. I was very, very dedicated to the Lord then, and my focus was pretty much on taking care of the chapel, teaching these, whatever they were, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, Bible school, singing in the choir, and then, of course, when you're cleaning up the chapel and nobody's there, you take that opportunity to go up to the pulpit and pretend that you're delivering messages and all the rest of that. So I did that, a fantasy of a kid that's 18, 19 years old, just really not sure he's going to do with his life. But Navy, as it turned out, the Lord provided the direction through the Navy to do a lot of things that probably ordinarily would not have had the opportunity to do. Fly was one of them. Get into the ministry later in life was another one of them. But in any event, I made it to the town of Kodiak a couple of times. The church and the USO. Usually I'd find a USO because that's where the girls hung out. Never really gravitated toward any one particular girl, but that's where the girls hung out, and every once in a while you get a chance to dance with them, and so you did that. The only girl that appealed to me while I was there was this redheaded girl that worked in the office down from the chaplain's office. Very, very attractive girl. And one night, and she sort of took a shine to me. So we would, have conversation. Nothing went beyond that. But and there were a couple of girls up at the chapel, but they were all, I guess I just naive and young and really wasn't ready to form those kinds of relationships. But this one girl, very attractive, red-haired girl, she and I were dancing there at the USO, and I didn't know that she was going with somebody, a big fella. Always these big fellas, and so. One night I said, well, you've got a car here. Would you like me to drive you back out? And she said, yeah, why don't you do that? So I drove her back out to the base, and it parked, and all of a sudden this door opened, and this really big guy grabbed hold of me and whacked me one upside the head. And I just looked at him. I said, why did you do that? And I said, I don't want to fight you. I think I could have taken him. He said, well, this is my girl. I said, I had no idea it was your girl, If this is your girl, then I apologize to you for perhaps, invading your territory, whatever it was. But it really was nothing more than just she and I had his dance. We drove back to the base, and that was it. He said, well, I accept your apology. I'm sorry I hit you. Got blood. I'd borrowed a shirt from Bill Flanagan, nice white shirt. I didn't have one. and got blood on it. And I took it back. I said, "Hey, Bill, sorry this happened, but it just happened." He said, "Doyle, don't think anything of it." So, as a matter of fact, he says, I think I was getting ready to go back to the States. He said, "My dad has this Cadillac. I'll let you borrow the car when you get back." And I said, "Okay, Bill." It never happened. I had visions of me going back, having this Cadillac, but it didn't happen. Bill was from a very wealthy family, and as it turned out later in life, he became a even more wealthy corporate attorney. He was out in San Francisco for a long time. He and I used to swap letters, and then down to Christmas cards, and then finally they just lost all kinds of communication. But in any event, about a month and a half, 2 months before I left Kodiak, one of the fellows that was over in the barracks, and I can't remember his name now, but he worked over in the personnel office. He said, "Doyle, I've been looking at your record," and he said, you scored very high on your clerical administrative scores, and really would like, if you're pursuing a career, they didn't have chaplain's assistant in the Navy then. If you're going to stay in the Navy, and I had no intention of staying at the time, he said, "Why don't you come over and do two things? Number one, work in the personnel office, and I'll show you what goes on there. And number two, put in for personnelman A school back in Bainbridge." He said, "Because I think you'd get it, and I think that it might get you into a career that you might be interested in as far as the Navy is concerned." And I said, "Sounds good to me," because I had no idea what that was all about. It just sounded good. It was clerical. It was dealing with people, and I'd always enjoyed working with people. So I did. The last 2 months I was in Kodiak, I went over to personnel office. Back then, their personnel accounting was done by typing all the information that was necessary. There are two things that are important. Well, four things are important when you're in the Navy. One is your pay record, your health record, your service record, which has all your personnel stuff in it. And then in personnel accounting, what they call a 500 card. It was a yellow four-page thing, carbon paper in there. And so for 2 months, I would prepare these 500 cards. People would come aboard the station. Hadn't been trained to do it, but that's what I would do. And sure enough, they picked me up, selected me for personnelman A school. And so I finished up my Navy, my time at Kodiak in the personnel office, and as it turned out, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. This guy saying, "Hey, I think that you might fit into this field, this career field, personnel," and so I was selected. And after 18 months in Kodiak, Alaska, I was selected for and transferred to Bainbridge, Maryland, outside of Baltimore, for basic personnelman school, called Personnelman A School, and for 3 months spent there learning how to be a personnelman. And and we'll talk about that in just a little while. This is the emblem of the United States Navy Recruiting Command. I was in recruiting 2 times. The first time as an executive officer of the recruiting district down in Memphis, 4 states, and then the last time as commanding officer of the recruiting district in Louisville. But this is a recruiting badge. Every recruiter has that. That's the inside thing here. And then this is a gold reef that's given when you have achieved an excellence in recruiting and have done some things to get people into the Navy. And then what are not in here, but I have 3 silver stars that go into here, not the Silver Star Medal, but 3 for excellence in recruiting. So this is the recruiting emblem. Every recruiter begins with this, and then gold reef, and then you add stars at the top as you achieve more excellence in recruiting. Now, if we pan up, John, we'll show you some of the medals and awards We'll start at the bottom here. This is the Republic of Vietnam Service Medal for service in the Vietnam War. The next one is, these two are awarded by the next two awarded by the Republic of Vietnam. This is a Vietnamese award, as is the next one. And then I'll just take them across. Well, they really go in this order. And then this is the National Defense Service Medal. Here is a meritorious unit commendation for excellence in recruiting when I was commanding officer of recruiting that the entire district got. This is a Navy Good Conduct Medal with 2 Bronze Stars. They used to say every 4 years, if you kept 4 years of undetected crime, and then you get a conduct, and when you get to be an officer, you're expected to have good conduct, and so you don't get more awards for that. And then all the way over is the Navy Commendation Medal. That's given in recognition of something above and beyond normal duty and commendation given by the Navy. The next one is a Joint Service Commendation Medal. That's what I got for serving in a meritorious way on the Joint Staff, the United States Southern Command. And then this is the Meritorious Service Medal, which was given to me, presented to me by Admiral Malone, recommended by Admiral Sackett for service at the Chief of Naval Air Technical Training Command, and then I received the award again. That's what the Bronze Star is for. Second award was given to me as a result of service as commanding officer of the Navy Recruiting District in Louisville. So Meritorious Service Medal with the Bronze Star because I had been given it twice. And then this is a command insignia, a commanding officer of a shore activity. There's another one given to those that are commanding officers of forces at sea. Just a word about this one. Sort of special. I was in the top half, 1/10% of 1%, one of 2 Navy-wide that had been selected who were, I was in limited duty officer, which meant my specialty was in administration and human resources. Only 2, at least at the time I was in, that were selected to be commanding officers of a recruiting district. Normally, when you're selected to be a commanding officer of a recruiting district, you have just completed a tour either as a commanding officer of an aircraft squadron or a commanding officer of a small ship. And then you're selected to go be commanding officer of recruiting district. As I say, I was just one of 2 limited duty officers who came up through the ranks that specialized in administration that were selected to be a commanding officer of recruiting district. So I'm sort of proud of that. And but in any event, that's what those things signify. And of course, the 3 stripes are commander. Let me just, I don't want, someone once said that if you have to tell somebody who you are, you aren't. But then there's another saying that says if you don't toot your own horn, it will not be tooteth. I enlisted in the Navy at 18, high school dropout after my sophomore year, because Mom and Dad just couldn't afford to. We were going to a private school, Flagey High School. In any event, and we were having some difficulty at home for other reasons. And so I went into the Navy after finishing 2 years of high school, enlisted. While in the Navy, I finished undergraduate school. Every time I'd go someplace in the Navy, I would find a college, I would enroll, do correspondence courses, whatever it took. And so after 28 years in the Navy, I got my undergraduate degree in human resource management from Pepperdine University. And that was a significant thing in my life. Went from high school dropout to undergraduate completion, and then later finished graduate work and with a PhD. And so it was, that too was significant. But in the Navy, to enter as a seaman and then progress through all the enlisted ratings, personnelman third, personnelman second, personnelman first, chief personnelman, and then to be selected as warrant officer. And then I went W1, commissioned officer, commissioned warrant officer, W1, W2, W3, and then W4. But when I was selected for Lieutenant JG, Lieutenant Junior Grade, I went from Chief Warrant Officer W2 to Lieutenant Junior Grade, skipped ensign, but you keep going up in the warrant structure. You're selected, you have to be selected, and then when you are selected, if you're selected for a Lieutenant Commander, then you are no longer a Chief Warrant Officer. And so I'd gone to Chief Warrant Officer 3, Chief Warrant Officer 4. Most Chief Warrant Officers, that's it. But I went on and then was selected for Lieutenant, Lieutenant Commander, and then Commander. And so when I finished the Navy career as a commander, that was special because I'd gone up to, they call them Mustangs. And then when you are selected to command, a commanding officer, that doesn't happen very often. Not when you've come up that way as a Mustang. Sometimes, like Al Sackett did, you entered as a seaman and you went out as a rear admiral. But during that time, you've transitioned to not to limited duty anymore. You've gone to, and they send you to Newport and all the rest of that. Had I gone to Newport, might have happened too. But I was very, very blessed, very, very fortunate. And so, having enlisted at the age of 18 as a seaman recruit, and then after having, and it's all competitive. I mean, it is extremely competitive. In order to do this, my fitness reports as an officer were always, as they call them, two-blocked. You have excellent, you have outstanding, and when you're two-blocked, you're outstanding all the time. And because God blessed me, because I worked hard, there are 4 things I always tell folks that work for me: show up on time, do the job, and get along. And then you have to have assignments along the way, and you have to be recommended along the way by people who really have faith and confidence in you and believe that you can achieve that higher rung. I was blessed. I was given support, encouragement, and hard work, due diligence, was able to go as high as I could go. Just before I retired, the guy said, "Hey, stick around because they're going to pass this law. You can go up for captain. You're in the top 1/2 of 1%. You'll make it." And I said, "No, it's time to call it quits." And so I retired and went to seminary. After I retired from the Navy, attended seminary for about 1.5 years, ran into Hebrew and just couldn't get it. It was written backwards. They dropped a lot of stuff out. Spent hours and hours at the carousel in the library, special studies with the professor of Old Testament who also did the Hebrew. It just didn't work. So I did some postgraduate work with psychology, counseling psychology, and then PhD in personnel management. But then after leaving the Navy, and after taking care of some schooling along the way, the first job I had was commanding officer of Navy Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, and and professor of naval science in 2 high schools, Valley High School, Butler, both in Louisville, and did that for a year and during the last part of that year, was sent a advertisement by my twin brother Dale saying, "Hey brother, have you seen this?" And it was a position for the Christian Appalachian Project, was in Lancaster, Kentucky. They were looking for a director of personnel administration to set up their human resource department. So I applied for that, got that, went down there for about 2 years and set up the human resource personnel department for them, and was their director of personnel and administration. Was down there for about 2 years, and the president of that was a Catholic priest, Monsignor Ralph Biding, and he invited me to go street preaching with him in Appalachia, Kentucky. Did that a couple of times. He had this old new Lincoln, and he'd throw some sound equipment in the trunk, along with some Christian literature, and we go out and he and I would street preach. We'd stop the car at a little town in Kentucky, a lot of little towns in Kentucky, break out the sound equipment, preach for about 15 minutes, pass out the literature, put the stuff back in the car, go to the next town. And he'd do that every summer for 2 years, invited me to go with him, and I did that. During that time, got a call from Larry. He was a research psychologist, got his PhD in educational psychology, and introduced computer-assisted instruction into the Navy in Memphis, Tennessee. And Larry had become affiliated with a high-tech company called Universal Energy Systems, and they were into supercomputers and a lot of different stuff, high-tech stuff. And Larry had written a request for RFP to introduce high technology into advanced helicopter training down at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And he knew the technical stuff, but he didn't really know a lot about project management. So he contacted me and said, "Hey, how about going down to Dothan, Alabama, Fort Rucker, and be project manager for this high-tech project?" And I said, "No, I really didn't feel called to do that." And so he called me back about 2 weeks later and said, "Really need you to go?" I said, "No, really don't want to go." And then he called me back about a month later, actually called us back, Lori and I. And I said, okay. And so I flew up to Zenith, Ohio, interviewed with their vice president and president up there, and they said, yeah, they thought that'd be a great idea. So the family, Lori and Justin, Stephanie and I moved down to Dothan, Alabama to be senior research scientist and project manager for this project to introduce high technology into advanced helicopter training for the Army. Lasted for about 6 months, and I really didn't care anything for doing that. It was like being back in the Navy again. And especially when Larry, who I later discovered had bipolar manic depressive conditions, he couldn't quite get what the GS-16 down there was looking for. He said, "Doyle, can't you talk Larry into just, giving us something that we can use?" And so retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Max McGraw and I hammered out this plan of action and milestones, presented it to him. He thought that was a great idea. Flew up to Ohio, conferred with their staff of high techs and research psychologists, went back down, and they bought it, except I said, this isn't my cup of tea. And so I contacted the Christian Appalachian Project. They said, yeah, be delighted to have you back. And so we pulled the plug down at Fort Rucker after about 6 months and relocated back up to Lancaster, Kentucky, where they made me director of spiritual programs and planning, which I did for about a year. Got another PhD to work with me to hammer out another plan of action and milestones for setting up some programming there. And then while we were doing that, had gone up to Winchester, Kentucky for one of the Church of God camp meetings. And while I was up there, a guy came up to me whom I had not met before, who apparently had gotten some kind of information on me, and said, "We really would like for you to consider coming to be pastor of the Fern Creek Church of God just outside of Louisville." And I said, "I really hadn't thought about that, hadn't felt a call about it, but I'll go back and think about it." And we did for about 3 months, and he called me back a couple of times. His name was Marshall Orender. And so about 4 months later, we accepted that call, went to pastor the church at Fern Creek, which we did for 2 years. Very happy doing that. They had a parsonage on a hill, little small church, about 50, 60 people, really nice. And while I was doing that, bivocationally, took a job as regional, I think the title was Regional Director for the Arthritis Foundation, to set up some offices in that part of Kentucky. And we did that concurrently with pastoring the church there at Fern Creek. And then I got a letter in the mail from the Director of Development down at Christian Appalachian Project saying, "Doyle, have you seen this?" And it was an announcement they had received from another Christian nonprofit ministry in Wheaton, Illinois called Bibles for the World. And they were looking for a director of administration. And I said, "No, I hadn't seen it, Bill. Thanks for sending it." And so I thought about that, prayed about it for about a month and a half, and then gave him a call, said, "I understand you're looking for a director of administration." And Dr. Rochunga Puyudaidi for Bibles for the World contacted me. He said, "Really would like for you to come up and visit us, and look at us and see what you think." And so I flew up to Chicago. Wheaton is about 35, 40 miles west of there, visited their place, very impressed with the Bibles for the World. The ministry was to mail Bibles to folks whose names were in telephone directories in all these different countries in the world. And they'd mailed about 7, 8 million of them, but the goal was to mail 1 billion. I forget now what, that was in 1986, mail 1 billion by the end of the 20th century. And so in any event, why we did, Lori and I, the kids, went up to Wheaton, and for about 8 months, I became the Director of Administration for Bibles for the World and began setting up a couple of programs for them to facilitate their doing that. They had also brought over another who had been a vice president over CBN, and he was going to be their director of development, and his name was Norm Berman. So between Norm and I, while we attempted to do that, he was still there when I left, and then we decided that really wasn't what the calling was, and so we pulled stakes on that. Rich experience, never forget it. We're going to set up a volunteer network, about 10,000 volunteers, had developed plan of action milestones to do that, and subsequently they did. They relocated to Colorado Springs, but still mailing Bibles around the world. So in any event, why we went back to Louisville, didn't have a job, I just felt a call to go back there and started doing some consulting, Fortney and Associates. And then I got a call from Ernie Gross, who was the pastor of Larchmont Church of God, for whom we had also served on staff for about a year after, also when we were going to seminary. And he said, "Doyle, we had the highest attendance we've ever had recently within the last 7, 8 years, about 320 folks. We really would like for you to come back on staff as the associate pastor for youth, and also working with us to see what we can do to grow the church." And so we went back there as associate pastor for youth, and at the same time we're doing some consulting in Fortney and Associates, and then Ernie left. He went to take a smaller church in Georgia. In Georgia, he had been down there before, and so they asked me if I would become interim pastor. We had been there now for about a year, and I said, yeah, I would do that, while we both thought and prayed and thought if perhaps we might stay there. And as it turned out, we did. Stayed for about 7 years. 7 years as senior pastor of Larchmont Church of God there in Louisville. Same time we were doing that, sort of bivocationally, where it was doing a little consulting, and also one of the members of the congregation asked if I would lend them a hand. They were having some difficulty in attempting to keep them out of bankruptcy, reorganization, Chapter 7, 11, whatever it was. Did that for about 3 months, but and kept them solvent, at least when we left, out of bankruptcy. Midwest Conveyor Systems. But that was about in the 4th or 5th year, but then decided we just full-time pastored the church there at Larchmont. We did for another 2 or 3 years. And so we were there about 7, 8 years, and then received a call asking if we would consider going to Mount Carmel, Illinois, to be the senior pastor up there. And after praying about it, thinking about it, we drove up, took a look at it, thought, well, 7, 8 years, yeah, it might be time for someone else to come in there at Larchmont. And we went up to Mount Carmel, Illinois, and spent a couple of years. The church grew a little bit, but not a lot. They had about 220. And when we left, I had bypass surgery and had a little difficulty, some complications with that. Was out for about a month and a half, 2 months, where we couldn't do anything, just recovering from that. And then after we had recovered, they wanted us to stay, but we decided the kids were in both in college out at Mid-America, decided we'd go ahead and move out to Oklahoma. So we did. So we came out to Oklahoma, really not knowing what we would do out here. I had finished recovering from the bypass, and so that was no longer a problem. So we moved to Oklahoma, and when we did, let me look at my notes here. And when we did, we got here, and I was looking for something to do, and there was another nonprofit called Youth Cornerstone, which was serving the needs of disadvantaged, mostly teenager kids. And I did some consulting with them at first, and then hired on with them to attempt to do some long-range planning and establish another network for expanding that ministry. The only thing I remember about that was that it was good work, a lot of work, did some planning for them, did some groundwork on setting up expansion, and had an opportunity to meet a fellow who was to become the district attorney for Oklahoma County, Wes Lane. And Wes and I spent some mornings. He'd get in early, I get in early, and he and I shared a passion for ministry and for the Lord, and it was sort of a rich experience. And then let's see what happened. Oh, they offered me a job. We were still living out in Guthrie, and so they offered me a job as executive director of the Logan County chapter of American Red Cross. And I had nothing else to do at the time, and thought, well, yeah, that probably would be a good thing to devote some time and energy for a while. And so about 8 months, 7 or 8 months, I did that, helped them to write a plan, they and their board, for about 7 or 8th month, and had a good time doing that. And that chapter is alive and well and still doing well. But one of the members of the board of directors was the center director for the Guthrie Job Corps Center, and he said, Doyle, we're looking for someone to run our human resource department. It wasn't a big department, just 2 people. And I said, well, Yeah, I have degrees in that and very keen interest in it. Yeah, I'll do that. So for 2 years, went and became Human Resource Manager, Director for the Guthrie Job Corps Training Center, and did that for 2 years. Had a lot of fun doing it. Met a lot of really nice kids, facilitated their growth, and it was just a rich time. When we were doing this, we were worshiping at Belle Isle Community Church, where we had established our worship because the kids were both going to Mid-America, and that was one of the larger Church of Gods in the area. And that eventually led to another employment opportunity. Let me see how that, if I can remember how that worked. They were just beginning to grow when we got there, about 780, 790, something like that. And Marty Grubbs was the pastor, and they were just beginning to really begin their growth period. And Marty asked me if I would, and we were teaching Sunday school there. You remember John Spence walked in one morning with his cup of coffee, and that was our introduction to the relationship that we formed and have maintained over now for about, 12 years, John? And in any event, Marty said, would you think about coming on board as one of the staff pastors? And I said, yeah. I was looking for something to do with the Youth Cornerstone, and while at Youth Cornerstone, determined that we probably would try to give a little more effort to Fortney and Associates in consulting. So we partnered with Profiles International, did that for about a year. But after that, we had begun worship at Belle Isle Community Church and was teaching Sunday school there. And Marty and I talked, and he thought it might be a good idea if I came aboard staff as pastor of Senior Adult Ministries. And so we did that just before they moved to their present location on Portland and became Crossings Community Church. And so for about a year and a half period, why I was pastor of Senior Adult Ministries there at Belle Isle, and then transitioned out to be continued pastor of Senior Adult Ministries at Crossings Community Church. And at the time, they had grown from about a little over 700 to maybe 2,000, 2005, something like that. And the Senior Adult Ministry consisted of there were about 400, 450 that were senior adults. The ones that actively participated was a lot smaller than that, maybe 100, 120, something like that. But in any event, did that for about a year and a half. And then it just, and I was attempting to introduce some new things, programs into that phase of ministry. Just the time didn't seem to be right. Still about 75, 100, 120, something like that, but really not involving that many more people, even though I attempted to introduce some new programming into it. And so we seemed to be just sort of status quo. And so one day I called Tom Ward, who was serving on the board of directors there. He had been a member of the personnel committee when they brought me aboard. And he was also board of directors up at Anderson College, Anderson University now. And so I said, Tom, let's have lunch together. Could you do that? And he said, yeah, we could do that. And so he and I went and had lunch. Can't remember now where it was. And I had mentioned to Tom, I said, Tom, for whatever reason, I've talked to Marty about this, it just isn't clicking. We just seem to be on sort of status quo here. He said, well, Doyle, I appreciate, number one, you're leveling with me as to where it was, and also you're concerned that maybe this isn't the time for, or maybe you're not the person, I don't know, for this kind of growth. And so in any event, about a month and a half after Tom and I had lunch, Steve Seaton, who was another pastor there at the time, said, let's have lunch. He had lunch. He says, Tom and I and Marty talked, and this may not be the time, and so maybe we'll just let this program, what's the word, just sort of let it leaven for a while and wait for what may be a better time as far as the growth of the program is concerned. And besides that, why a couple other fellows were helping me at the time, Pastor Noss and Jerry, and I said, okay, well, let's do that. And so I left staff there, and for about a 3-month period was just sort of in hiatus, looking for another direction, and received this call. And I had been sending some resumes out, ministerial briefs, and received this call from North Carolina at the High Point Church of God. And they were running, I guess, about 70, 80 folks out there. And so the call said, we would like for you to consider coming and serving as our pastor. Please come out and take a look at it. And I said, well, okay, sounds like a pretty good idea, because I'd already researched it, and I found out who they were, where they were, what their attendance was, and the fact that they were all African American. And so Sister Amerson said to me, but I was wondering if you knew that we were all black. And I said, well, did you know that I'm all white? And we both laughed about that, but we both knew, each of us knew that was the environment in which we would be going to pastor. And both of us agreed that it might be time for it to become multi-ethnicity, multi-generational, all the rest of those things. And so for a 2-year period, we went out, and it was a rich experience, just absolutely rich. Made some dear friends, and relationships were formed. Regrettably, at the end of the 2-year period, it was still all black and all white. Lori and I were the only 2 Caucasians there, and I guess we recognized that. But the thing that I remember about that ministry was, on Sunday, there were 20, 25, 30 kids, all African Americans, and they'd all come down and they'd sit on the right hand side of the church all the way forward, where you usually would find the amen corner, but they were all kids. And every Sunday, they were there. And so I would preach not only to the congregation that were adults, but the kids too. And then at the end of the service, I'd go in the back, as pastors usually do, and greet people as they were leaving. But each one of these kids, it was special to me, because I was able to lift most of them up, and the ones that were too big, I just hug them and tell them, God loves you and so do I. And so they heard from this Caucasian white preacher, I love you and God does too. And they heard that every Sunday, and that was rich to me, and I hope it was rich to them, and it carried forward in their lives as well as it has to mine. For months, a year after that, a couple of years, I'd get a call from various members of the congregation, and they would say how rich a time it was for them too. One was named Chick, and the other was, well, there are several of them, and it was a rich experience. While we were there, it was sort of a bivocational experience, because couldn't afford to pay a lot, and we still had the house back in Guthrie, and there was still a heavy mortgage. John Spence was helping us at the time. He was sending us a tithe for almost that entire 2-year period, perhaps a little bit more than that. And we will always remember that and cherish it and thank him for it too. Never forget that. I took this job bivocationally as the human resource director for Sears. They had a call center there, a little over 1,000 people. And then after I'd been there about 6 months, the person who had been the HR director at one of their larger call centers over at it wasn't Winston-Salem, the other large city at Greensboro, North Carolina, and he had some difficulty, and overnight they had asked him to find another employment opportunity. And then the regional guy called me and said, would you consider going over and being HR over there as well as where you are now? And I said, yeah, I would. So for about year and a half period while I was HR director for those two, and then one smaller one, 3 call centers for Sears. Pretty big job, very big company. And but when we left High Point to come back to Oklahoma, we left that too, and then we came back to Oklahoma. Then that's when I did a little bit more with Fortney Associates. Have never done, just never invested the effort and energy and what it takes to really make an independent consultant agency work. And it always ended up just being me, and Lori would help, and now Steph would like to help, the family would like to get involved again, and John would like to do something, and so we may try to do some more with that. But in any event, I tried that for a little while, and then got wind of the American Red Cross chapter there in Logan County, was looking for executive director, and I did that for about 8 months. And then on that board of directors was a center director for the Guthrie Job Corps Center, and they were looking for someone to maybe move their HR department up a notch, and so I went with them for 2 years, and I think we did that. Formed some really great relationships out there, and they had about 600 trainee students, and was able to be a part of that experience. And then my neighbor came home from work one day and said, I wonder if you've seen this. And it was an ad in the paper, and they were looking for a chief of Office of Human Resources for the Oklahoma State Department of Health. And I said, no, hadn't seen it, but I may apply for it. And so thought about it, prayed about it, and sent them something. Long story short, they liked what they saw. They brought me on board, and so I stayed with the State Department of Health for 6 years with the state. Was able, in a very good way, I think, the commissioner was looking to raise that human resource department to a higher level of effectiveness, and we did that. Workforce Planning, Leadership Institute, a couple of other things, for about 6 years, and then the opportunity presented itself to retire early again. I'd been there 6 years. That's all you needed to combine it with your age and take early retirement. And so voluntarily, I might add, I chose to apply for that and took early retirement from the Department of Health. And that brings us up to where we are at the present day. Two experiences when I was there with the Department of Health I'd like to share with whomever this is being viewed by. One is it gave me an opportunity to do some things in human resources that I really had wanted to do, to utilize the 50 plus years I had in HR and the education that I had that prepared me for that. And I had been doing some special research on transformational HR and shifting a paradigm from what had originally started out in most human resource areas as being transactional. You'd process the papers. You would recruit the people, fill out the papers. You bring them on board and fill out the papers. You would train them and develop them. You fill out the papers, and you would facilitate that. There were other things going on too. You had compliance issues that you had to deal with. You had all the personnel issues that you deal with when you deal with people. But in terms of doing the kind of strategic human resources, melding and bringing that together with business needs so as to introduce how the human resource works with the capital resource and all the other resources in order to really make companies and organizations and institutions and individuals become all they can become. So it would be an opportunity to take that transactional HR to strategic and incorporate that kind of human resource, the people element, into the strategic plans of companies, institutions, organizations. And then there's another transition to transformational. You go from from transactional to strategic, and then strategic is always involved in this, but transformational, so you can transform not only the individuals, but the institution, organizations too, to become everything that they were intended to become. For me, that resonated. That's exciting, particularly in the people part of it, because I think that's God's plan. God's plan is to take an individual and transform that individual from what they are into what He intends for them to become. And in a sense, that's lifetime stuff. That takes you from cradle to grave. You never stop learning. You never stop developing. You never stop transforming from what you are, what you've been, to what you are, to what God intends for you to be. I think that works not only for individuals, I think it works for institutions, organizations. I think it works for cultures. I think it works for nations. I think it works across the board, because I think that's God's intention from the beginning, to take creation and to build on that in order that all of that can become everything that He intended for it to become. That's exciting to me. That's transformational stuff. And that's where I am now. One of the things I think I want to try to introduce into Fortney and Associates, or whatever we call it, is to help people, institutions, organizations, cities, governments, whatever it can, help them to become everything that God intends for them to become. I see the sacred and the secular combined there. I really don't see them as being different. I see it in an eclectic, holistic way. I see them as a part of God's plan to transform us, to hold us. And so that's a strong motivation, strong resonance, a strong quest I have now to perhaps be a part of doing that for whatever period of time that is left to do. So that's one thing that occurred to me. It's been occurring to me for years, but the last couple of years in the Department of Health, because I did at night, and some of the things I introduced into the health department, transformational type stuff. But in the process of doing this, I was looking perhaps to maybe expand that a little bit, and I think I got ahead of God's intent, perhaps ahead of mine too, because I was sitting at my desk one day, I received this call, and it said, Dr. Fortney, they called me that because of the PhD thing. He said, do you have anyone there, and I found out later, this is a guy up in Canada, you have anyone there that might be interested in doing some senior HR advisory work over in the United Arab Emirates, and with the health department over at HAAD, Health Administration Abu Dhabi. And I said, no, I don't think we have anybody who would be interested in that. I can check around. But I'll tell you what, I might be interested. And the guy, he knew that because when he called me at the private number, and he knew exactly who he was calling, he knew exactly why. And so I said, give me a couple of days to think about it. Well, so we went home, discussed it with Lori, and prayed about it, and went back the next day and said, yeah, I think I'd be interested, because all this stuff is working there in the back of my mind. And so he said, okay, we'll set up, I'll send your Vitae resume over and let him take a look at it. So about 2 weeks, call back, not him, but from Abu Dhabi, and they said, and they got their head recruiter over there and said, we'd like to set up a telephone interview. And so he did, and we had the telephone interview. It lasted for an hour. I was up in my study, and there were a couple of the vice presidents over there, and it went well, and they said, we'll pay you away. Come over and visit with us. And because we like what we hear, and I was in the transformational stuff. And so I did. I caught an airplane, went to Dulles, from Dulles to Frankfurt, from Frankfurt to Abu Dhabi, and it didn't affect me much on the way over. It did on the way back. But in any event, went over there for 3 days, interviewed with their CEO, a couple of vice presidents, and it looked great. It really felt good too. $500,000 a year, not bad either. Do transformational stuff. Senior HR advisor to the Abu Dhabi HAAD. So in any event, came back and really got slammed because the jet lag, and I wasn't feeling all that great. But got a call back about a week after I got in there and said, really like what we saw. We would like for you to send us your passport so we can begin the security check. So that was on Friday. So I sent them the passport. Well, on the passport, I really didn't pay a lot of attention to it at the time, but on the passport, it's got your date of birth. And Monday I got a call, and the recruiter said, Doyle, he said, I don't know how, because they made me a tentative offer. I don't know how to tell you this, but we found out that you were over 60. I was 75 at the time. You're over 60, and we don't hire people in Abu Dhabi over 60. And I thought, well, is there any requirement to that? No, he said, it's our law. We don't hire people over 60. Apparently, the expatriates, they don't want a lot of old people coming over there getting health stuff, and then all of a sudden, so in any event, that was the other thing that happened while I was at the health department. So here we are now, about to embark on a fresh new adventure, and John wants to embark with us, and we'll see what God has in store. We're to the point now where I've missed so much. There are so many things I wanted to relate. There were so many stories. There are so many relationships. There's so many exciting things that we've done with all those whom we love, and there's not time. But every morning, and it's been this way as long as I can remember, every morning, get up at 5 o'clock and remember in my prayers and devotions all of you, every single one of you, and that will continue as long as I live. I love you, I bless you, and I thank you for making my life so rich.
Amen.
Amen.